It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in February 2023. 28 degrees outside. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin, it pushes through it, settles into your chest, and makes every breath feel like a warning. And on the east side of Detroit, Michigan, a woman was standing in front of a homeless shelter still wearing her hospital bracelet, holding a newborn baby girl wrapped in a thin hospital blanket that was never designed for weather like this. She had given birth 3 days earlier. She was still healing. She was still in pain in ways that any woman who has ever delivered a baby will understand without needing further explanation. And the man who had stood before God and witnesses and promised to love and protect her had just driven away without looking back. No hesitation, no final words, just tail lights swallowed by the dark, and then nothing but silence and cold air and a baby beginning to stir against her chest. Her name was Camille. She had $43 in her bank account. Her phone had been disconnected. The nurses at Detroit General Hospital had begged her not to leave so soon. Her body wasn't ready. Her baby was barely 72 hours old, but there was nothing left to go back to. Because while she was lying in that hospital bed exhausted and completely unaware, her husband had already changed the locks on their apartment, removed her name from the lease, drained their joint bank account, and blocked her on every platform and every number she had for him. He had not just left her. He had methodically, deliberately, and carefully erased her, like she was a problem he had finally solved. What Marcus Webb did not know, what not a single person on that Detroit sidewalk that February night could have imagined, was that the woman standing in the cold with a newborn and $43 was the sole heir to one of the most significant Black-owned business dynasties in American history. And every person who played a role in putting her there was about to have their lives turned completely inside out. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now stay with me, because this story is going to make you furious, and then it is going to make you feel something you were not expecting. Camille Antoinette Rousseau was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1991. Her mother's name was Diane Rousseau, and if you had met Diane in her prime, you would have understood immediately that she was someone who was supposed to do extraordinary things with her life. People who knew her described her the same way across the board: brilliant, magnetic, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately became the most interesting person in it. She had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, in a household that the surrounding neighborhood quietly admired, not because it was flashy, but because of what it represented. Her father, Elijah Rousseau, had built something from the ground up that most people said couldn't be done. In the early 1960s, Elijah Rousseau was a 23-year-old Black man in the American South trying to break into real estate development. Every traditional bank he walked into showed him the door. Not because his business plan was weak, it was sound, and the loan officers who reviewed it knew it, but because of what he looked like and what year it was, and what that combination meant in Memphis, Tennessee in 1962. So Elijah did what people do when the system refuses to open the door. He found another way in. He gathered Black investors from his church, his neighborhood, his community. He hired Black contractors and Black builders. He broke ground on his first property development with his own hands and built every relationship required to sustain it with his own integrity. He was relentless and patient in equal measure, and that combination is rare and it is powerful. By 1975, Rousseau Group LLC owned 14 properties across Tennessee and Georgia. By 1985, they had moved into commercial real estate and construction contracts spanning 6 southern states. Elijah had built something that the people who refused him loans in 1962 could not have imagined sitting across the desk from that young man. By the time Camille was born in 1991, the Rousseau Group was approaching $340 million in valuation. Elijah was one of the most respected self-made businessmen, Black or otherwise, in the entire region. He had built it without shortcuts, without compromising who he was, and without ever forgetting where he started. Diane grew up inside all of that. She had every advantage her father's hard work could provide: private school, travel, access to opportunity that most people never see. And she was sharp enough to appreciate it, which made what happened between her and Elijah all the more painful. In the late 1980s, something fractured between them. A rupture so severe that Diane left Memphis entirely, severed all contact with her father, and moved to Detroit. The full details of what happened between them were never made entirely public, and Camille herself has said she only ever learned fragments of the story as an adult, pieces that were heavy enough to explain everything without ever needing to explain it all. What we know is that Diane arrived in Detroit alone, built a life that was smaller and harder than the one she had left, fell into a relationship that ultimately did not protect her, and by the early 1990s, was raising baby Camille completely on her own with no family support and no safety net beneath her. She was trying. By every account, Diane loved her daughter fiercely and completely. But she was also fighting battles inside herself that she had never found the right help for, and in 1995, when Camille was just 4 years old, Diane lost that fight. She died of an overdose. There was no note, no emergency contacts listed anywhere. No will, no instructions, no one who came forward to claim her daughter. The following Thursday, the state of Michigan took Camille into the foster care system. She was 4 years old. She had a small bag of clothing, and she had absolutely no way of knowing that 3 states south, an aging man named Elijah Rousseau, who had been trying and failing to locate his daughter for years, was about to receive the worst and most clarifying phone call of his life. Elijah found out about Diane's death through a mutual acquaintance months after it happened. He immediately began searching for Camille, but Michigan foster care records are sealed by law and sealed thoroughly. Camille had no digital footprint. She was a child moving through a system that shuffles files more efficiently than it connects people. The trail went cold. His investigators hit wall after wall, but Elijah renewed the private investigation contract every single year, every year without fail. And every year on what he believed was Camille's birthday, he sat alone in his study in Memphis, looked at a photograph of Diane as a little girl, and asked the same silent question he had been asking for years. He wanted to know if she was okay. The answer, for most of those years, was complicated. Camille moved through 3 foster homes and 2 group facilities across 14 years. She experienced things during that time that she has chosen not to speak about publicly, and that boundary matters and deserves to be respected here. What can be said is that the system failed her in the ways it fails so many Black children in America. She was overlooked, mislabeled, moved around, and told in 100 different ways that she was not a priority. She was called difficult when she was grieving. She was called a problem when she was asking for something reasonable. She absorbed those messages because children do. They don't have the context yet to reject them. But Camille Rouse had something in her that nobody in that system managed to reach or remove. She got straight A's through every school she attended. She won a partial academic scholarship to Wayne State University in Detroit. She worked part-time jobs to cover the rest of her tuition. She chose to study social work because she wanted to understand the machinery that had shaped her childhood, and eventually she wanted to change it. She was disciplined, and she was focused, and she kept most of her interior life private because she had learned early that privacy was a form of protection. She had never had a real family, never had an adult who chose her without being paid or assigned to do so. That absence had shaped her in ways both beautiful and dangerous. It made her incredibly resilient, and it made her deeply hungry for belonging. And that hunger, as it turned out, was something that Marcus Webb had identified and was prepared to use. Marcus Webb was 29 years old when he met Camille in the spring of 2017 at a community fundraiser on the west side of Detroit. He was white, good-looking in a forgettable kind of way, and he had the specific type of charm that works on people who have not been charmed very often, which is to say, he was attentive and consistent, and he remembered small things. He called when he said he would. He showed up when he said he would. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. For a woman who had spent her entire life waiting for someone to simply pay attention to her, Marcus Webb felt like something she had stopped believing was possible. His family was working class and from Dearborn, Michigan, a suburb with a long and well-documented racial history that Camille, in the warmth of new love, did not spend much time researching. His mother, Patricia Webb, was a retired school administrator with fixed opinions about how the world was ordered and who belonged where in it. The first time Marcus brought Camille home, Patricia smiled warmly with her mouth and said all the right things and looked at Camille with eyes that said something else entirely, something careful and cold that Camille noticed and filed away and told herself she was probably misreading. His friends, most of them white men from Dearborn, had conversations among themselves about Marcus's relationship that were framed as concern, but rooted in something much older. Marcus dismissed those conversations publicly and engaged with them privately. And that gap between his public and private self was the thing that Camille never saw clearly until it was far too late. She was in love, fully, genuinely, completely in love in the way that people are when they have been waiting their entire lives for someone to choose them. When Marcus proposed in October 2017 with a simple ring and a quiet dinner, she said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in March 2018. Small ceremony. Camille wore a dress she had found at a consignment shop on Woodward Avenue and altered herself over 2 weekends. She looked beautiful. There are photographs. In the photographs, Marcus is smiling. And standing in almost every single one of them close to Camille, always touching her arm or laughing beside her, is a woman named Kayla Mitchell. Camille's best friend since freshman year at Wayne State, her maid of honor. The person she trusted more than anyone in the world. Remember that face, because Kayla Mitchell was not the friend she appeared to be, not even close. The early years of the marriage were surface-level stable. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near downtown Detroit. Camille worked at a nonprofit focused on youth services. Marcus worked in mid-level commercial property sales. They were not wealthy, but they covered their expenses, and they were building something, or so Camille believed. But there was a restlessness in Marcus that she felt without being able to name. Small comments would surface in ordinary moments, about her hair when she wore it natural, about the music she played in the car, about certain neighborhoods and certain social situations. They were always delivered lightly, always framed as personal preference or harmless observation. And Camille, who had been conditioned her entire life not to make a fuss, absorbed them quietly and said very little. What she did not know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that Marcus and Kayla Mitchell had a relationship that went far deeper than friendship and had for years before Marcus ever met Camille. Kayla had been the one to introduce them. She had brought Marcus to that community fundraiser in 2017. She had engineered the meeting. And the entire time that Camille was falling in love with Marcus, Kayla was already involved with him. The friendship, the loyalty, the years of shared confidences, all of it had been constructed around a deception so complete that it is genuinely difficult to sit with when you understand the full scope of it. When Camille discovered she was pregnant in the spring of 2022, she was nervous and hopeful in equal measure. She made Marcus breakfast on a Sunday morning in May, set the test on the kitchen table, and watched his face. He stared at it for what she later described as a long, still moment. Then he smiled, said, "That's great, babe," and pulled her into a hug. That afternoon, while Camille rested, Marcus made 3 phone calls. The first was to his mother, Patricia. The second was to a lawyer named Greg Holloway, who specialized in asset protection and had a reputation for creative document work. The third was to Kayla. The plan they discussed on those calls had actually been in development for months. The pregnancy simply gave it a new timeline. The 9 months that followed were physically difficult for Camille. She had no mother to call on the hard nights, no older woman in her corner who had been through it and could tell her what was normal and what to watch for. She leaned on Kayla completely, who was present, consistent, supportive, and asking questions constantly. "What are you most afraid of? How are you feeling about Marcus? What does your savings situation look like right now? What does the lease say about both of your names?" Camille answered everything because Kayla was her person, her safe space, the one relationship in her life she had never once had a reason to question. Every answer went directly back to Marcus. Every vulnerability was cataloged. Every piece of financial and logistical information was being used to build a case against her before she had any idea a case was being built. The plan was straightforward and deliberate. Wait until after the birth. Execute a rapid financial and legal separation during the postpartum window, when Camille would be at her most physically depleted and emotionally overwhelmed. Leave her with no shared assets, no legal standing, no time, and no resources to fight back. Marcus had been quietly restructuring their finances since November 2022. The joint account was being systematically reduced. Shared assets were being moved or reclassified. Greg Holloway had prepared a lease termination document bearing what appeared to be Camille's signature, a document she had never seen, never signed, and never been informed of. The building manager had processed it without question. And by the time Camille went into labor in February 2023, the apartment was already, on paper, Marcus's alone. Camille went into labor on the evening of February 1st, 2023 at 37 weeks. She called Marcus and he arrived at the hospital, stayed through the first night, and left the following morning saying he had a work obligation he couldn't move. He did not return. On February 4th, Camille delivered a baby girl entirely alone except for the medical staff who cared for her. She named the baby Alois, a name she had carried in the back of her mind for years without knowing why, without knowing it had belonged to her great-grandmother. She held that baby in the quiet of a hospital room and made her a silent promise that she was going to figure out how to give her everything. She had no idea what figuring that out was actually going to require. On February 6th, Marcus came back to the hospital. He brought no flowers and no food. What he brought was a document, a formal separation agreement already drafted by Holloway and already signed by Marcus, which he set on the hospital tray next to Camille while she was nursing Alois. He told her she should sign it. And then he looked at his wife, who had just given birth to his daughter 3 days earlier, who was sitting in a hospital bed still healing, and he said the words that a nurse named Sandra Acoy, who was standing in the doorway and could not believe what she was hearing, wrote down in her personal notebook that same evening because something told her those words were going to matter one day. He said, "You have nothing, you are nothing, and I am not spending my life tied to someone like you. Someone like you." Camille did not sign. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked down at Alois, and she said nothing at all. Marcus left and did not return. When Camille was discharged from Detroit General on February 8th, she called Marcus's number from a hospital payphone. Disconnected. She called Kayla. Voicemail, then blocked. She took a cab with Alois to the apartment. The key didn't work. A note from the building manager confirmed the lease had been terminated. She stood on that doorstep for 11 full minutes. A neighbor walked past and looked away. She had $43. She had a newborn baby in a car seat she had bought secondhand. She had a hospital bracelet still on her wrist. And she had a business card that a social worker at Detroit General had pressed quietly into her palm during discharge. The address of a women's shelter on the east side, with the words, "just in case," written on the back in pen. She walked into that shelter that evening and asked for a bed. They gave her a cot in a room with 11 other women. She laid Alois down beside her on that narrow mattress, pulled a thin blanket around them both, and cried as quietly as she could manage until she had nothing left and fell into an exhausted sleep. That was February 8th, 2023, and it was the lowest point of a life that had already contained more than its share of low points. For 6 weeks, the shelter was their entire world. Camille applied for emergency housing assistance and was denied twice on procedural technicalities that would have been navigable with legal help she did not yet have access to. She found part-time work at a laundromat 3 blocks away, working 4-hour morning shifts 3 days a week, trading childcare hours with a woman named Brenda Hayes. Brenda was 53 years old, a grandmother originally from Flint, Michigan, who had ended up at the shelter after an illegal eviction during a landlord dispute. She was steady and practical and warm in that specific way that comes not from having had an easy life, but from having survived a hard one with your character still intact. She held Alois without being asked when she could see Camille needed her hands free. She saved portions of her dinner on the nights she could tell Camille hadn't eaten. She asked no questions that weren't hers to ask. In a story populated by people who failed Camille spectacularly, Brenda Hayes simply showed up every day. And that mattered more than Brenda probably ever fully understood. On a Tuesday morning in mid-March 2023, a letter arrived at the shelter's front desk addressed to Camille Antoinette Rousseau. Not Wells, her married name. Rousseau, her birth name. A name she had not used publicly since she was 18 years old and had applied for her first adult ID. The envelope had no return address. The postmark said Memphis, Tennessee. Inside was a single index card, handwritten in the precise and deliberate script of someone elderly and careful. It read, "Your mother's name was Diane. Your grandfather's name is Elijah. He has been searching for you for 24 years. Please call this number." Brenda found it in the mail stack and brought it to Camille when she came back from her shift. Camille read it standing in the hallway, still wearing her work clothes, Alois on her hip. She read it 4 times without speaking. Then she sat down on the linoleum floor of that shelter hallway and did not move for 20 minutes. Brenda sat down beside her on the floor without a word and simply stayed there. Camille's first reaction, when she finally spoke, was that it was a scam. She had seen predatory schemes targeting shelter residents before, promises of inheritance, long-lost family connections, financial windfalls designed to extract personal information from desperate people. Brenda listened to every word of that argument, and then she said, "Honey, a scammer doesn't know your mother's name." It took 3 more days. 3 days of Camille turning that index card over and over in her hands, reading it last thing at night, first thing in the morning, studying the handwriting like it might eventually reveal something new. On the 4th day, she asked the shelter's front desk if she could use their phone. She dialed the number. An assistant answered, placed her on a brief hold, and then an old man's voice came onto the line. It was unhurried and low, the voice of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was finally, with great care, beginning to set it down. He said one word, just her name. "Camille," she said yes, and he said, "Baby girl, I am so sorry it took me this long." She did not speak for almost a full minute. On the other end of the line, Elijah Rousseau, 81 years old, the man who had built a $340 million company from a single land purchase in Memphis in 1962, the man who had been searching for his granddaughter since 1995, simply waited. He had been waiting 24 years. 1 more minute was nothing. When Camille finally spoke, she asked him one question. She asked what her mother had been like as a little girl, and Elijah talked for 20 minutes without stopping. He talked about Diane's laugh, about how she argued at the dinner table about everything, and he had secretly loved every second of it, about how she could read a room faster than anyone he had ever known, about how he had missed her every single day for 30 years, and about how the granddaughter he had never held was already, as far as he was concerned, the most important person left in the world. Now here is the part of the story that answers the question of how Elijah found her, because it matters, and it is extraordinary in its own right. His private investigation firm had been running updated searches on Camille Rouse annually for over 15 years. Michigan's sealed foster records had blocked every early attempt to trace her. She had no social media accounts under her birth name. She had moved multiple times. But in January 2023, while Camille was in her 3rd trimester, one of Elijah's investigators finally connected a Wayne State University alumni database record to a marriage license filed in Wayne County, Michigan, in 2018. The name on the license was Camille Antoinette Wells, formerly Rousseau. From the marriage license, they traced a hospital admission record at Detroit General. By the time they confirmed she had been there, she had been discharged to no listed home address. It took 3 additional weeks of careful, methodical work to locate the shelter. 3 weeks during which Marcus Webb had moved Kayla Mitchell into the apartment, the same apartment from which he had forged Camille's removal, and had already begun telling colleagues, family members, and anyone who would listen that Camille had been emotionally unstable, that the marriage had been deteriorating for years, and that ultimately she had walked away. He was constructing a narrative, rewriting history in real time. And he was very nearly getting away with it. 72 hours after the phone call, a dark, unmarked car pulled up outside the shelter on a gray Thursday afternoon. Elijah Rousseau stepped out slowly, using a cane, wearing a dark suit and a white shirt with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to be anything less than fully himself, regardless of the room he was walking into. He came through the front door of that shelter and asked for Camille Rousseau. When she came around the corner with Alois on her hip, this young woman he had spent 24 years looking for, carrying a baby he had not yet known existed until 3 days ago, Elijah opened his arms, and Camille walked into them. Alois reached out from between them and grabbed Elijah's finger with her whole fist. He looked down at that tiny hand and something happened in his face that the shelter staff who witnessed it later described the same way independently. It looked, they said, like a man being released from something he had carried so long he had forgotten it wasn't a permanent part of him. They flew to Memphis the following morning. It was the first time Camille had ever been on a plane. Elijah gave Camille and Alois the east wing of his home and told her to rest for as many days as she needed before they talked about anything else. She took 3. Then she came to him and said she was ready. The second thing Elijah did was introduce her to James Carter, his lead attorney, a precise and formidable litigator based in Washington, D.C., who had worked with Rousseau Group for 18 years, and whose reputation in a courtroom was the kind that makes opposing counsel quietly reassess the strength of their own position before proceedings even begin. The third thing Elijah did was simply ask Camille to tell him everything. About Marcus. About Kayla. About the hospital room and the document on the tray and the 3 words the nurse had heard. About the locks and the forged signature and the $43 and the 6 weeks on a shelter cot. He listened without interrupting for over 3 hours. James Carter took detailed notes. When she finished, Elijah looked at James and said, "How long do we need?" James said 3 months, maybe 4. Elijah nodded once. Then he looked at his granddaughter and said, "You will not have to go back to Detroit for any of this. We will bring Detroit to us." What James Carter's team uncovered in the months that followed was extensive, carefully documented, and in several respects genuinely stunning. The forged lease termination was confirmed within the first 3 weeks. A forensic document examiner analyzed the signature bearing Camille's name and determined conclusively that it had not been produced by her hand. The financial records established a clear and documented pattern of Marcus systematically withdrawing and reclassifying funds from their joint account beginning in November 2022, 3 full months before Alois was born, which established premeditation in a way that removed any possibility of this being characterized as a spontaneous or emotional decision. Greg Holloway's paralegal, deposed separately from Holloway himself, admitted under oath that she had processed the notarized lease termination document without personally witnessing Camille sign it, a statement that created immediate and serious professional and legal exposure for everyone involved in the preparation of that document. And then there was nurse Sandra Accoy. Sandra had gone home on the evening of February 6, 2023, and written down in her personal notebook, word for word, exactly what Marcus Webb had said in that hospital room and exactly how he had said it. She had done it. She explained when James Carter's investigator reached her, because something in her gut told her it was going to matter. That notebook became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. "You have nothing, you are nothing, and I am not spending my life tied to someone like you." Those words, written down the same night they were spoken by an independent witness with no stake in the outcome, were entered into discovery and were later read aloud in a legal proceeding. But the most far-reaching piece of evidence was the text messages. Kayla Mitchell had conducted her entire coordination with Marcus through her personal cell phone, the same number Camille had listed as an emergency contact in her prenatal medical records. James Carter's team obtained those messages through legal discovery channels. They spanned 14 months. They were specific about timeline, specific about method, and in multiple instances explicit about intent in ways that foreclosed any argument that what had happened to Camille was anything other than deliberate and coordinated. One message sent by Kayla to Marcus on the night Camille went into labor read simply, "Is it done?" Marcus replied, "Soon." When those 2 messages were placed in front of Kayla's attorney during the discovery phase, her attorney advised her to stop answering questions immediately. Kayla did not follow that advice. She provided a statement to investigators that contradicted the text record in 3 separate and significant places, and those contradictions became an entirely separate problem on top of an already significant legal exposure. Marcus sat for his deposition in August 2023. James Carter conducted it himself. It was calm and methodical and completely without theatrics because James Carter did not need theatrics. He had the documents and the messages and the nurse's notebook and the forensic handwriting analysis, and he asked his questions in the unhurried tone of someone who already knows the answers. Late in the deposition, James asked Marcus directly why he had initiated the separation agreement within 48 hours of his daughter's birth. Marcus said he had simply realized they had different futures in mind. James asked him to describe that future. Marcus said he had wanted a family that looked a certain way. That fit into a certain world. James asked, with complete stillness, whether Camille and Alois fit into that world. The transcript noted an 11-second pause. Marcus said they had wanted different things. James said no further questions for now. Patricia Webb, who was present in the room, looked at the wall and said nothing. The judge who later reviewed that deposition transcript made a handwritten notation in the margin. And the people present in that room said that when Marcus finished answering those questions, the quality of the air in the room was different. By October 2023, the story had reached the press. A journalist at the Detroit Free Press received a tip from an unidentified source and spent 2 weeks verifying the key details against court documents and first-hand accounts from shelter staff before publishing. The piece was measured and precise, and it was absolutely devastating. It had every element that a story needs to travel: abandonment, forgery, a nurse's handwritten notes, 14 months of text messages, a billionaire grandfather who had spent 24 years searching, and 3 words spoken in a hospital room that burned themselves into the mind of anyone who read them. Someone like you. The story was picked up nationally within 48 hours. Cable networks ran segments. Social media amplified it to a scale that none of the principals had anticipated. Marcus Webb went from a private individual to a national story overnight. He gave one television interview, a local Detroit appearance in which he described the coverage as one-sided and insisted there was context the public was not seeing. The clip was posted online, analyzed in detail, and found to contain nothing that helped him. His employer, a mid-size commercial real estate firm in Dearborn, began receiving calls from the public. By Thursday, they had issued a public statement. By the following Monday, Marcus no longer worked there. Greg Holloway quietly withdrew from all involvement in the case shortly afterward. Kayla Mitchell posted a 4-minute video on Instagram in which she cried and described taking full responsibility while simultaneously spending most of the video explaining why the situation was more complicated than people understood. It received 34 likes. 12 of them were from her own accounts sharing it. The settlement was reached in December 2023, and the specific terms were sealed. But multiple sources with knowledge of the case described the amount as substantial. And what is a matter of public record is that Camille received full legal acknowledgement of the housing fraud, the financial manipulation, and the material and emotional damages she had sustained. Also a matter of public record. Following the settlement, Elijah Rousseau formally established Camille as his primary heir and the principal trustee of the Rousseau Family Trust. A separate trust established in the name of Alois Diane Rousseau, structured to mature on her 18th birthday, was valued at $12 million. Alois was 10 months old at the time of its establishment. Justice, when it arrived completely. But here is what nobody expected, and it is the part of this story that matters most. Camille did not buy a mansion. She did not hire a publicist. She did not give a single interview about Marcus Webb or Kayla Mitchell. She did not post one word about any of it on any platform. What she did, in the spring of 2024, was go back to Detroit. Back to the shelter on the east side where she had spent 6 weeks on a cot with a newborn. She sat down with the shelter's director, and she wrote a personal check that covered 18 months of the facility's full operating costs. And then she told the director she wanted to build something more permanent. Working with Elijah's foundation and James Carter's team, Camille established a dedicated initiative within Rousseau Group, a program providing transitional housing, legal advocacy, and financial counseling specifically for postpartum women who had been displaced by domestic abandonment, fraud, or abuse. Women who had been exactly where she had been, standing outside in the cold with nowhere to go. They named it the Alois Initiative, after her daughter. In its first full year of operation, the Alois Initiative housed 41 women and their newborns across Detroit, Flint, and Lansing. It provided pro bono legal consultations to 63 additional women navigating housing fraud and domestic separation cases. And Brenda Hayes, the woman who sat on a linoleum floor beside Camille the day the letter arrived, who held Alois during morning laundromat shifts, who said the 7 words that changed everything. A scammer doesn't know your mother's name, was appointed the initiative's first director of community outreach. On her first official day, Camille gave her a handwritten card that said, "You saved us both. Now let's go save some others." Elijah Rousseau passed away in April 2025, at home in Memphis, peacefully in his sleep, which is the ending a man like that deserves. He was 83 years old. Camille was holding his hand. Alois, 2 years old, sturdy and certain and completely at home in the world in the way that children are when they are genuinely loved, was asleep in his lap. He had spent 24 years searching for his family. He got 14 months with them, in his will. He had left a letter to be read into the official record by James Carter. It was addressed to Camille. It said, "Your mother left because she was hurting. You stayed because you were strong. The Rousseau name was always waiting for you to come home to it. I am so proud of who you are. Take care of Alois. And don't you ever let anyone tell you what you are worth again." Camille had it framed. It hangs in her office in Memphis above her desk, next to a photograph taken inside a shelter room in February 2023. A woman in a hospital bracelet on a narrow cot, holding a newborn girl in a thin blanket in the dark. She looks at both of them every morning before her day begins. Marcus Webb, as of early 2025, is working in residential property management outside Detroit. He has remarried. Kayla Mitchell is not part of his life. Patricia Webb has made no public statements. Greg Holloway is no longer practicing in Wayne County. And Camille Rousseau, she removed the name Wells quietly and without announcement, is 33 years old. She sits on 2 nonprofit boards. She's completing her MBA at the University of Memphis. She was recently invited to deliver the keynote address at a national housing rights conference, and she accepted. When she speaks about what happened to her, she is not angry. She is precise. She is clear. And she is the kind of devastating that comes not from volume but from certainty, from a woman who has already won and knows exactly how she did it. Alois is 2 years old. She has her great-grandfather's eyes, dark, still, and completely certain of their own worth. According to her mother, she already knows her last name. She says it every time someone asks her who she is. She says it without any hesitation at all. Rousseau. So here is the question I want to leave with you today, and I mean this sincerely. I want you to actually sit with it, if you were Camille. If you had survived every single thing she survived, and been handed the resources and the power to respond in any way you chose, what would you have done? Would you have gone public with everything? Would you have built something in silence? Would you have made sure that every person who played a role in putting you on that shelter cot knew exactly what it cost them? Or would you have done what she did, turned your worst chapter into someone else's rescue? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story reached you the way I believe it did, share it. Because there are women watching this right now who need to hear that where you start does not determine where you land. That the people who underestimate you are writing their own ending. And that sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is not a word. It is what you build. Drop the word ELOASC in the comments if you made it all the way to the end. I want to see how many of you are here with me today. And before you go, next week I am covering the story of a woman who discovered her sister had been living a secret life using her identity for 11 years. And the moment she found out, she was sitting at her own sister's wedding. Subscribe. You do not want to miss that one.